Welcome to part 3 of my Transformers The Last Night rewrite. If you haven't seen parts 1 and 2 yet, I would highly recommend watching them now, even if you haven't seen them in a while. It's probably worth giving them a look. The link is in the episode description. But in case you've got places to be, here is the abridged version of parts 1 and 2. Optimus Prime has been gone for 3 years. Decepticons have been arriving at an alarming rate, and Lennox is ordered to bring Cade Yeager in to stop the upcoming threat. Cade and Bumblebee await Optimus's return, but unbeknownst to them at the time, Optimus is imprisoned on Cybertron. Hound, Crosshairs, and Drift are nowhere to be found. Galvatron struggles to gain control of the Decepticons and converts to his original form as Megatron. Prime's captor reveals herself as Nemesis Prime, the creator of the Transformers, now calling herself Quintessa. Quintessa slowly starts to manipulate Prime, turning him into Nemesis Prime. Cade and Bumblebee are found by Lennox and convinced to stop the rising Decepticons. Hound, Crosshairs, and Drift find Ultra Magnus and Sideswipe. Hound informs Ultra Magnus and Sideswipe that they have detected Cybertron on their radar, closing in on Earth. The Autobots start to make their way towards Washington, D.C. Cade, Lennox, and Bumblebee arrive at one of the sites where a Cybertronian object rises from the ground. Theories have been spread about the Cybertronian objects, but no one really knows what they actually are. All we and the characters know is that these structures have been on Earth for hundreds of years, but have just risen from the ground. Megatron forms his Decepticon army, plotting his revenge on Optimus Prime. All the while, Nemesis Prime begins to close in on Earth, his hatred for Megatron fueling him. Washington, D.C. is destroyed, and conflict begins to form between Hound, Drift, Crosshairs, Sideswipe, and Ultra Magnus as they all start to combat each other's mortals. They lock on to Bumblebee's location and head towards Missouri. Megatron destroys Mission City, where the final battle of Transformers 1 took place. In the mountains of Missouri, a battle with the newly united Autobots and Decepticons occurs. The battle ends and an argument begins as the Autobots reveal Washington, D.C. was destroyed. It ends with Crosshairs splitting off from the team, leaving Cade, Lennox, and the rest of the Autobots distraught. Nemesis Prime faces off against the Autobots, leaving Crosshairs with fatal injuries, Hound captured, and the rest of the Autobots with little hope. Nemesis Prime confronts Megatron, recounting his past failures. Megatron leaves Earth to face Quintessa. We start off the scene with a timestamp, 36 days later. As the timestamp fades away, we find ourselves in the mountains once again. The Autobot ship is embedded in the side of the mountain. We are then inside the ship. Bumblebee observes a hologram as it continues to glitch. Cade works on a section of machinery. The hologram is finally cut short. Staggered footsteps can be heard. Crosshairs limps toward Bumblebee and Cade. Crosshairs' body is encased in an exoskeleton.
The others are still on patrol. No sign of Hound.
Any sign of Optimus? Crosshairs clenches his cane, slamming it into the hangar floor. He speaks through gritted teeth.
No.
Crosshairs
No!
Crosshairs collapses to his knees in pain and anger. Bumblebee swiftly stands to his feet and begins to carefully tend to Crosshairs. Bumblebee speaks through a series of beeps.
Easy. It's only temporary.
Crosshairs looks at Bumblebee, slightly saddened when he hears Bumblebee's artificial voice.
You should be injured more often. You are more tolerable. Yeah, like you're any better. That was a joke, Crosshairs. Ease up.
Cade starts to chuckle in the background. Crosshairs scoffs, but slowly starts to calm down as Bumblebee rewires the unfinished exoskeleton supporting Crosshairs' fragile body.
I'm sorry about Optimus.
Bumblebee does not respond, but he gives a somber look to Crosshairs. The scene then shifts, and we find ourselves on Cybertron. Quintessa stands tall, overlooking the approaching world, Earth. Megatron has been captured and is suspended in the air with shackles on his wrists and ankles. Billions of lives. A world of life. But it is a small price to pay for salvation.
This universe is not yours to destroy.
And it is yours. Megatron says nothing to that. Quintessa begins to mock Megatron. Ah, yes. Of course it is. Quintessa glares at Megatron, seemingly in thought. Quintessa holds a hand out towards him. Megatron winces in pain. A moment passes. You fear him, don't you?
I fear no one, even creatures of your design.
I merely created Orion Pax, but I am not responsible for the abomination he is today. You are.
Get out of my head.
You gave Orion Pax strength, authority, a purpose. You allowed him to steal the title of a Prime, a title that was rightfully yours. For revenge, you destroyed your own home. But look at you, the deed split your spirit to the bone. Megatronus, you are unbalanced, bested by a mere librarian. You failed. Megatron clenches his fist. He desperately tries to break free of his bondage. Megatron is able to gather enough strength to break the chain holding his right arm. Megatron strikes Quintessa with his fist. Immediately, Quintessa summons another chain to hold Megatron back. The chain begins to tighten on Megatron's wrist. It pulls back slowly as Megatron's arm nearly separates from his body. You dare to strike your god. Quintessa closes her eyes. She holds a hand out towards Megatron once more. Dark clouds of smoke cover the sky. As far as the eye can see, rubble has replaced the majority of the giant city. The distant screaming of civilians is haunting. A few aircraft carriers depart from the city. A Decepticon crawls through the rubble with one arm. Heavy footsteps can be heard. A look of desperation and panic comes across the Decepticon's face. He tries to move faster, but he is too late. Through the fog, Nemesis Prime slowly walks toward the Decepticon.
No, please, I'll do anything. Please, don't kill me.
Nemesis stands over the Decepticon, motionless. For a moment, a look of mercy forms on Prime's face.
Optimus, what happened to you?
The look of mercy immediately turns to rage. With one swift motion, Nemesis raises his sword above his head. A look of terror forms on the Decepticon's face.
No, Optimus!
Nemesis Prime drives his sword into the Decepticon's chest. Prime stands still. Through flashes, we can see the events of the battle. It seems to have no effect on Prime as he launches into the sky, leaving the sword embedded in the chest of the Decepticon. The scene then shifts, and we find ourselves panning over a large forest. Distant sounds of battle can be heard. The camera increases in speed as fire spreads throughout the forest. The forest is slowly replaced by a burning city. Aircrafts loom just above the few standing skyscrapers of the city. The music swells as the sounds of gunfire and shouting intensifies. It then cuts to Ultra Magnus, Sideswipe, and Drift clearly on the defensive as they are pushed back by dozens of Decepticons. A very small faction of the military along with Lennox are there as well, providing help when they can. We see civilians desperately attempting to rush through the chaos. We see Ultra Magnus successfully aid many humans in escaping while still fighting many adversaries. We see the same with Drift and Sideswipe, but they are far too focused on the battle. Of course, the Autobots are severely outmatched, but they are still able to hold their own against the engaging Decepticons. I also need to mention Ultra Magnus, Sideswipe, and Drift's appearance in this scene. Paint has been stripped from sections of their armor, revealing bare metal as well as several scorch marks and wounds. They've been fighting for weeks now, and it's definitely taking a toll. Aircraft carriers descend to the ground as Lennox gathers civilians to safety. Lennox begins to shout orders as the hangar doors of the aircrafts open. Women and children first, make it fast. Lennox watches two soldiers rip a small child away from his father's hands. Lennox's face softens as he remembers his own daughter, wondering if her and his wife are safe. Lennox then allows the father to follow his son into the carrier. The man looks at Lennox with tears still in his eyes. Thank you, sir. Lennox only smiles, nods, and turns away to direct more civilians into the carrier. Soon, the carriers ascend into the sky, leaving Lennox, Ultra Magnus, Sideswipe, and Drift to fend for themselves. It then cuts to Six-Shot as he barks orders to the other Decepticons.
Destroy those carriers. Let none escape.
Thundercracker and Blitzwing swiftly transform and begin to fly across the battlefield. It then cuts to Ultra Magnus, Sideswipe, Drift, and Lennox as they notice Thundercracker and Blitzwing moving toward them as they continue to fight off the remaining Decepticons.
Autobots, stand your ground.
It then cuts to the aircraft carriers as the extra thrusters are engaged and the carriers increase in speed. It then cuts to Thundercracker and Blitzwing rapidly approaching the Autobots. It then cuts to Ultra Magnus as he and the other Autobots realize the Decepticons' true intent.
No. Drift, cut him off.
Drift transforms into a helicopter and flies toward the gaining Decepticons to intercept them. Ultra Magnus and Sideswipe exchange worried looks. The music begins to fade. Drift is inches away from the Decepticons and he starts to transform and readies his sword. It's too late. Missiles are fired and Drift's sword just grazes Thundercracker's wing. Ultra Magnus and Sideswipe desperately try to shoot down the missiles but to no avail. The missiles connect with each of the aircraft carriers, instantly killing the terrified civilians inside. Shock crosses over each of the Autobots' faces as debris falls from the sky. The still living crowd of civilians erupts into chaos. The scene then shifts, and we find ourselves on a familiar snow-covered mountain. The wind blows as the mountain is rapidly covered with fog. The camera pans over a cliff. Through the fog, we can see a body, covered by snow, ice, and mud, with a hint of dark green underneath. The camera focuses on Hound's frozen optics, which flicker from a dim blue to a black. Through flashes, we see the events that transpired after Megatron departed. We see Blitzwing, Barricade, Motormaster, and Swindle beating Hound to a pulp. Hound, missing an arm, is no match for the 4 Decepticons. Hound is stabbed in the side by Blitzwing. We then see Hound being dragged to the edge of the cliff. As Motormaster holds Hound over the edge, he sentences him to death.
Hound, as a member of the Autobot Resistance, you are a traitor to Cybertron and are hereby sentenced to death.
Hound briefly eyes the wrist rockets on Motormaster's arm. However, he is too weak to act upon it. Motormaster releases Hound from his grip and watches as he falls. Back in the present, Hound's eyes shoot open as ice and dried mud starts to break away from his body. He uses the side of the cliff to break off the remaining ice from his arm. Energon leaks from Hound's many open wounds, especially where his arm once was. Still incredibly injured, he starts to make his way up the side of the mountain. The scene then shifts, and we find ourselves back inside the Autobot ship with Cade, Bumblebee, and Crosshairs. The ambient sounds of the vessel echo throughout the walls. Sparks fly from various sections of the ship. Cade sleeps while Bumblebee watches a flickering hologram displaying a news report. Crosshairs works nearby, attempting to build upon the fragile exoskeleton that is now mounted on a stand. Cade slowly starts to wake up. Instead of sitting down with Bumblebee, he walks towards Crosshairs. Crosshairs, how are you holding up?
Can't you see I'm busy?
Cade scoffs and turns away from Crosshairs. Crosshairs stops him.
Cade, listen, I'm sorry. I know you're trying your best, and I know I can be tough.
That's an understatement. Crosshairs lets out a laugh, however it is more genuine and less arrogant. Cade is hesitant for a moment, but he begins to speak. But thank you. That means a lot, especially coming from you. Crosshairs nods his head.
Now if you excuse me, I need to get back to work.
Cade starts to turn away, only to turn back. Oh, by the way, steady your hands.
What?
I noticed you have shaky hands while welding. In order to have a strong weld, you need to weld in a straight line, so steady your hands. Crosshairs is confused for a moment, possibly by Cade's act of goodwill. He then gives a slight smile.
Thanks for the tip. I'll keep that in mind.
Crosshairs then turns back to his work while Cade starts to walk towards Bumblebee. The hangar door of the ship suddenly jolts open and the sound of heavy footsteps follow. Ultra Magnus, Sideswipe, Drift, and Lennox slowly enter the aircraft.
Debriefing in 5,
The scene then shifts, and we find ourselves back on Cybertron. The planet is now looming over Earth's moon. Megatron is still suspended in the air, his body almost limp. Quintessa is nowhere to be found. Two Cybertronians stand tall, observing Megatron. Only the muffled sounds of Cybertron are audible. Nemesis Prime enters Cybertron's atmosphere. He descends toward the planet's charred metallic surface. Nemesis motions to the guards. The gigantic Cybertronians exit the chamber. Nemesis Prime and Megatron glare at each other in silence.
The proposition still stands, and so does mine.
Nemesis Prime says nothing to that, turning his back on Megatron.
Oh, Optimus. Always so naive.
Rage immediately takes control of Prime. At unbelievable speed, Nemesis activates his forearm blade and drives it into Megatron's torso. Nemesis stares daggers into Megatron. He removes the blade from Megatron's torso. Energon leaks from the wound. Nemesis slashes the blade across Megatron's face. A giant gash is now across Megatron's eye. Megatron groans in pain.
Optimus Prime was weak. I destroyed him. No. The rage. I've seen it once before. The two of you are one and the same. You are a part of Optimus as he is a part of you.
Nemesis only glares at Megatron. His stare breaks when he turns towards space. Megatron struggles to speak. Once he does, he begins to taunt Nemesis.
You've become a monster, Optimus. But that started long ago. When was the day, Optimus? What caused you to go mad? I did not go mad. I took the rage, the pain, and made it serve me. I made myself anew and burned the former self into cinders. I understand that you did the same. It was only a matter of time before you broke.
Nemesis Prime says nothing to that, and only turns back to Megatron. His piercing purple eyes fall upon Megatron.
Now who's the villain, Optimus? Now who's the villain?
The scene then shifts, and we find ourselves back inside the Autobot ship where a debriefing is taking place. Ultra Magnus is leading the meeting with Sideswipe and Drift by his side while the others listen intently. Flickering holograms display Cybertron approaching Earth, multiple destroyed cities, Nemesis Prime, and Megatron.
In the past several weeks, Decepticon forces have stormed various locations around the world, most being large cities with a dense population. How many cities have fallen? Luckily, more than 40% are still standing. Still, casualties are suspected to be in the millions. And the military is sparing their resources, only sending small factions to engage the Decepticons. How many Decepticons are there? As of 36 days ago, there were only 9 of them. Their numbers are now growing rapidly. Drift, Sideswipe, Linux, and I were able to draw the Decepticons' attention away from Chicago, and the city was safely evacuated. From what we've seen, Six-Shot is the one leading the attacks, with Megatron still MIA.
Cade hesitates for a moment. Any sign of Optimus?
We trailed him for several days, but lost his signal 28 days ago. We can only infer he is in league with the Decepticons and is also behind many of the attacks. That can't be right. When Optimus returned, Megatron went missing. Do you think Megatron is what he's after? We can't know for sure, but I suspect that has something to do with it.
Sideswipe then points to Cybertron on the flickering hologram. Before anyone else can speak, the ship starts to rumble as an alarm sounds. The sound of the hangar door opening echoes throughout the vessel. The Autobots all exit the debriefing room and they all train their weapons on the intruder.
One step closer and we open fire.
As the intruder steps forward, we recognize exactly who it is.
Alright, easy does it, lads. Easy does it.
The Autobots lower their weapons. Hound stands there, hunched over. He is covered in dirt and most of his paint is stripped away. The Autobots take in Hound's state.
Thanks for the warm welcome.
Hound receives a few laughs from the members of the team while Crosshairs observes him more carefully.
You look like hell.
Hound turns to Crosshairs.
This is hell. The Decepticons are taking control. Optimus has gone insane, and we are severely outmatched. But don't you worry. Daddy's home.
The Autobots walk back into the ship as the camera focuses on Crosshairs as a look of worry and then a look of content washes across his face. Before we move on in the rewrite, I just need to clarify two things. All of those scenes should be in Act 2 of the rewrite. When structuring a story like this, especially one with this amount of stakes, the characters should definitely suffer at the tail end of Act 2. I always bring up these two movies, but in Avengers Infinity War and Endgame, the suffering of our characters begin when Thanos snaps and ends when the characters travel back in time. In the rewrite, our characters begin to suffer when Nemesis Prime arrives, and that feeling of hope comes when Hound returns. Obviously, this rewrite is one movie, which brings me into my next topic. I would say this version of Transformers The Last Knight is approximately 3 hours, maybe even shorter. I've mainly focused on setting and characters in this rewrite, which is probably why the film feels shorter than it actually is. I haven't given much screen time to people reacting to events or multiple military montages. Those scenes can be littered throughout the movie as long as they don't interrupt the pacing. However, I wanted this movie to feel personal, which is why most of my scenes either introduce a character or a plot point, establish character arcs, or set up or pay off a certain idea in the film. Now that was a long tangent. Without further ado, let's officially begin Act 3.